What's the crack? It's your boy Teriak. What's up, boys? I don't even know how to fucking... It's on Discord. I thought it was going to be on StreamYard. But what's the crack? It's your boy Teriak back at it again for another debate for that boy.
Dude, my state of mind's gonna be all over the place. But what's the stream?
It's a debate between Mida and Teriak about atheism being dead.
Oh, that's damn. I wish I didn't have such strong protagonist vibes. I might be able to. I would love to be part of that conversation. But anyway, I'll let you guys have at it.
I'll do an open afterwards if you decide to hop in. So
can you PM me? I'll jump in.
Yeah, of course.
All right, thank you, buddy.
We'll go into the closed room.
Yep.
All right. Gentlemen. All right. Stream is set. Mida does not cam up unless Mida cams up, but
oh, I only have a camera on my phone, so it's a little bit rough to try to, get good audio quality and service on a phone on Discord.
I'm gonna have to buy you a VTuber, and it's gonna be a female rabbit.
You know what? I could just get a Lola Bunny VTuber.
Exactly. And it would be so diametrically fucked up. How's it going, Teriak?
Not too bad, not too bad. Just making sure my screens aren't fucked. Say with the whole managing the stream, then trying to debate as well. Oh god, multitasking is not my forte.
And you shouldn't have to. You're the talent around here. Exactly.
You should be my manager, Kai. You know what I'm saying? I won't have none of the shenanigans. You know what I'm saying? Just have the stream set up and everything. Have like Joe Rogan has his Jamie. I'll get my Jamie in. You know what I'm saying? Make this shit work, man.
Done deal. And a giant mug.
Also, a giant tin can as well. You know what I'm saying? So just for the water as well. You gotta be prepared. You never know how long it's gonna go.
All right, so we are going live. Let me switch everything up. Well, we're already live, but there's nobody on the screen. Okay. Welcome, everyone. Today, we are hosting a debate to see if atheism is dead. With me today, I have Teriak on the affirmative and Mida on the negative. And the prompt is, atheism is dead. So the way we're going to go ahead and do this is we will have 5-minute opening statements, and then we'll just go straight to cross, and then open discussion. And then we'll do closings. So we will start with Teriak. Go ahead.
Cool beans, honorable judge, respected opponent, and fellow citizens. I stand before you today to declare that atheism is not a bold new truth, but an ancient error whose time has finally passed. In Plato's Laws, he warned that denying the gods is a dangerous disease of the soul. Today, that warning is more relevant than ever. The atheist claims everything arises from blind chance and soulless matter. The gods are mere inventions of poets and priests. Hence why I'm doing this poetically. There is no divine mind, no providence, no ultimate justice. Yet this view collapses under reason's light. How can lifeless matter produce the exquisite order we see in the cosmos? Precise revolutions of the planets, the harmony of nature, the rational structure of reality itself. Order does not emerge from chaos without intelligence. The very existence of the soul, which moves and knows, proves that mind is prior to the body. The universe bears the signature of a divine craftsman. Even more troubling, atheism destroys morality. If there are no gods who care about justice, why should the strong not oppress the weak? Why restrain greed or cruelty when no final reckoning awaits? A godless society inevitably breeds lawlessness and tyranny. My opponents may point to the rise of modern atheism and declare God is dead. And we might actually get into that Nietzsche quote. Nietzsche was not an atheist. But I reply, atheism is dead. Its intellectual foundations have crumbled. Every time an atheist appeals to reason, justice, or the beauty of the universe, they unknowingly borrow from the divine order they reject. Their philosophy is passing delusion, sustained only by youthful arrogance or willful ignorance. True wisdom recognizes what the heavens themselves proclaim. Gods exist, they govern with justice, and the denial of them is no longer intellectually respectable. It is a relic, an empty shell of a thought that cannot support a flourishing life or a stable society. Let the atheist prove the soul comes after the body, or that perfect order arises without mind. Until then, the verdict is clear. Atheism is dead. The divine order endures. This is basically stylized or personified in terms of the mind of Plato, essentially. Plato argued actually in laws that like the death penalty for atheists, because it's that dangerous of an idea. Essentially, when you erode the higher power, there's no like objective standard you can point to. That's why everything just goes down to it's just your opinion, brah. Like the whole moral relativism and all this kind of stuff. And essentially, like this is why we see even that like intellect goes on the same level of ignorance. There's no like objective standard we can point to. You know what I mean? And like for the materialist as well, the main thing to prove is the unchanging. How would you prove an unchanging standard? We just point to motion. This is from Heraclitus. Motion, everything in reality is in motion. Even a rock lying on the ground has atoms. Those atoms have electrons. Those electrons spin. Everything in the known universe is moving, which means another word for moving is changing, which means changing is unchanged. It's unchanging. So that's a unchanging principle we point to, which is how we get from philosophy to mathematics, to science, to physics, the law of gravity. You know what I mean? That's basically what, when we say that there's a divine order, there's a divine being, what we're pointing to is that there's unchanging principles that govern this reality. And with that, I end my opening statement.
And with time to spare. All right, Maida, your opening?
Well, I didn't necessarily prepare an opening, but I'll go for it anyways. So generally, there's going to be a couple attempts to justify anything such as atheism being dead that you will see tonight on behalf of my opponent. One of the biggest ones will be a logical fallacy, which is directly tied to the idea or principle of Christianity being the overseeing arc or thing that created the ideas of morality. This is largely founded in the idea or the principle of a fallacy that is generally associated to or with what is referred to as the God of gaps fallacy, in which people attempt to use religion to fill in the gaps of their knowledge of the understanding of things like moral principles or ideological frameworks that even they attempt to adhere to. Another great example of this is how many of the governing principles that are outlined within the moral guidelines of the Bible are fundamentally rejected in the modern day by most people who are Catholic or Christian in general, while also simultaneously claiming the death of atheism, which has actually been on the rise as of the last 60 years with a significant decline in Christianity, Catholicism, and an expansion of the Muslim empire throughout the entire world. We are seeing a fundamental shift away from the ideas of Christianity, Catholicism, and general religiosity when it comes to moral principles or even the frameworks that are founded within them. And there's no real reason to sort of ideologically back the religious principles because in and of themselves, they don't rely on the morality that they were originally preaching or proposing, nor have any value in a modern sense as society has deviated so much away from what was originally founded upon. And to expand upon that a little bit, a lot of the logical experimentation that has been used to try to prove religion or religiosity throughout the history of like science or anything else has generally just attempted to be a complete failure. Even Aquinas' 5 ways was generally disproven as begging the question and creating logical fallacies in and of itself for its starting premise, and relying on leaps of faith or things like unsupported premises to be able to justify itself, rather than having any form of existing entity or proving that existing entity completely infinitely of completely regardless of creating an infinite regression. The second one that I will talk about is the Kalam cosmological argument, which again fails to explain the nature of time and make any claim against the chaos theory or the randomness of universality, while simultaneously rejecting the scientific method that it claims to rely on, even creating a system in which it logically applies with the idea that a God doesn't exist or the beginning of being, but also scientifically rejecting the idea of universality in and of itself, completely independent of chaos theory.
Excellent. Excellent. All right. Carry on.
Is it open dialogue or is it rebuttals?
You can rebut that.
Yeah, I'm not a Christian, bro. I'm talking philosophy, not theology.
Is that the whole rebuttal?
Yeah.
Okay, so the problem with that is there are usually ties to the specific type of theological beliefs and the types of philosophies that you ground those theological beliefs in. A lot of examples of this is people who are religious, specifically coming from the Christian or Catholic camps, usually use the epistemological belief systems to try to justify the things that they believe. However, if you're going to take an ontological stance on these things, I think it is significantly harder to make a claim for things like objectivism if you were going to view it in that way.
So all right, we might as well just get straight to open. Might as well just get straight to the open dialogue. Let's go.
Yeah, so again, I'm not talking about theology. I'm literally like pointing to Heraclitus, like the philosopher Heraclitus.
So sure, like and in this specific circumstance, we're talking about religion, correct?
No, we're talking about atheism.
And atheism is a rejection of religion, is it not?
No, it's a rejection of a supreme being.
Well, generally speaking, a supreme being is attached to religion, as deities are specifically a derivative of divine knowledge, are they not?
Well, so like how Heraclitus would put it is like the flux that governs the cosmos of the flux is the principle that governs change across the universe, or the cosmos, as he would have called it.
Sure.
This is not.
But if we're going to talk about metaphysical, sure. And if we talk about metaphysical changes and how the universe operates, there are a lot of specific things that you can use.
Physical changes.
These would be metaphysical. Well, how do you determine whether or not something is physical or metaphysical without being able to have the scientific method to prove it?
So the physical, it can be like measured. Like this is what the whole materialist is. Oh, I only have the empirical. I only want the empirical, the material. That's all that's real. But when you observe the physical, even like the scientists would agree, like everything is in motion. If everything is in motion, everything is in constant change. This change is unchanging. That's an unchanging principle. That is a divine principle. It's unchanging. Same way like the law of gravity all of a sudden doesn't change.
Well, the problem is you're associating divine to this. Divine specifically implies something that is of a higher being. This would be religious in nature.
Yes, a being. We are becoming.
Well, no, that's not what being means in this specific circumstance. I'm talking about an entity, not necessarily the individual actor.
Yeah, so like a simple way, like Joe's simulation theory. Oh, like this is just all a simulation, all this kind of shit. Every simulation must have a power source.
Sure, I agree. There can be a power source that exists
independent. There's a higher power to the simulation. That's what Christians mean when they say God.
So, okay, do you think the higher power in this specific circumstance always creates a system that leads back to a divine argument or a God, rather than just a system that exists independent of our ability to observe it?
Yeah, what I'm doing is I'm making an observation of reality and then pointing that the observation of reality points to an unchanging principle. And that's how we got science in the first place. Science came from philosophy.
Sure, but again, this doesn't necessarily dictate the conclusion that you're arriving at of some level of divine-like entity.
What, are you talking about like Spaghetti Monster or BG Jesus or some shit like that?
I mean, it can be whatever you want it to be. That's the problem.
What? No.
You see
what
how
the fuck?
No, this is exactly how it works. You
So,
can use
yeah,
the
so-
justification
So
of
we
something
get
that
logic.
exists.
One sec. We get logic from BG Jesus.
No, some people can derive logic from that. Some people can derive logic
How?
from other. This is the problem with religiosity.
How would you get unchanging principles from BG Jesus?
Well, you're just describing the God of gaps fallacy, as I talked about in my opening statement.
I'm like I said, I went purely philosophical. I never mentioned anything about the religion. I'm talking philosophers. That's why my whole opening statement was Plato. This is why bringing up Heraclitus' quote about the flux being the law that governs the change across the universe. This is an unchanging principle that's undeniable. For to even deny it requires motion. Everything presupposes motion in reality.
Yes, and what you're specifically referring to is divine intervention. You even use the term divine in and of your statement.
Divine intervention. What? What do you think divine means?
Divine literally means like superseding like standardness or creating something that is a god or godlike structure.
Yes, a higher power, an objective standard.
Yeah, okay. Let's assume that you
the
don't
only way
deviate.
That is possible is for there to be a divine being or a supreme being.
No,
because
so
we
you're
are just
begging the
becoming.
question now. So what you're doing is begging the question. This is one of the standards that was held to one of the most, well, yes. So like Aquinas' 5 ways. Are you familiar with this?
Becoming means it changes. Okay? Being means it never changes. It's unchanging. Right? So when you say supreme being, you're talking about like a higher power that never changes. This is why I'm pointing to a law. Like the law of gravity, for example. Like on Tuesday, all of a sudden the law of gravity the equation doesn't change.
Well, again, this is it's a non sequitur because the law of gravity is something that exists independent of our ability to confirm that this law is true, independent of our ability to test it. What we could be experiencing in this, we cannot.
Yes, we can. Motion is empirical, correct?
Yes.
Yes, so we can test it. We can provide physical evidence that everything in the known universe is changing. And then we can prove it logically as well.
No, what I'm telling you, this is independent of what my claim was. What I'm telling you is our ability to be able to test this to the extent in which the technology we are currently limited could offer alternative means of being able to justify the phenomenon that we know as gravity. One of the ones that is commonly accepted, even amongst some of the top scientists and physicists, is centrifugal force.
And
do you refute that?
A force presupposes motion.
Yes, but you have yet to link how motion could be a divine
the claim
in and of itself.
The claim is that everything in reality is in motion. This is an undeniable claim. Yeah, and you agree. Yeah, which means change is unchanging. Change is constant. Which means unchanging principles exist, aka laws of logic, laws of gravity, etc., etc.
Well, no, I'm telling you, I don't disagree with the notion that you were creating. I disagree with the framing that this could lead to a higher idea or a higher power of some sort in and of its creation. Just because it has
what does that mean?
Sure, I can give you an example.
A higher power of its creation. What does that mean?
So, okay, then let's go to that. How do you justify logically a series of events that leads to both something that is logically conclusive while also simultaneously not being able to put that through the scientific method?
Sorry, say that again. How can you test?
I said, how can you test something that you deem to be logically conclusive without being able to put that through the scientific method?
Yeah, you can test it.
Sure. Can you give me an example of
motion?
Sure.
Is empirical.
And when we talk about empiricisms and
motion
the things
is unchanging.
and when we talk about empiricisms and how these things affect each other, what is the relation that it has to some idea or concept of expanding divineness?
Everything in the physical changes, correct?
Yeah, we're looping.
Yeah, I don't think you understand, because I think you're kind of prepared for, like, you're going against a Christian and you had like this whole shtick with the Christianity thing, and then I hit you with philosophy and now you're like, oh fuck. Like everything in the known universe is changing. But that change is constant, which means there are unchanging principles, unchanging laws that govern reality. That's when if someone
Okay.
says, "Oh, like this exists, but it's unchanging. It's physical, but it's unchanging." It doesn't make sense. It ceases to make sense. You know what I mean?
No, my problem is not whether or not I expected a certain debate. My problem is that you use the term divine in reference to how these things work. This is generally a word or a
Yes.
term that is associated with something within a religious like system. Is it not?
No, Heraclitus was not a Christian.
That's fine. And again, you
It's
can use the term
philosophy.
independent of that.
It's philosophy, not religion.
So when you're making this claim that something is divine, are you referencing something that exists outside of religion or no?
It's a higher principle, a higher law of order. Like, are you going to
Okay,
deny
so
that the solar system
is this-
exists?
No, is this higher law of
Yeah.
order something that is derivative of a religious idea or concept?
No, it comes from Heraclitus, bro. One sec, I'll actually dig out the quote. 'Cause you're going to agree with this. And this is why I say, like, atheism is dead, bro. Well, Heraclitus calls the logos, which again, I will admit, like, the Christians like copied a lot from the Greeks and all this kind of shit, particularly Aristotle. But one sec, where is it? Yeah, so the logos to point to the hidden rational structure of reality, the eternal principle of order, measure, and unity that governs change, or the flux as he refers to opposites and across the cosmos. Not merely human speech or logic, but something divine-like, common to all and often identified with ever-living fire that transforms all things while maintaining harmony.
So again, it uses the term divine. This is where I have the problem. Is it's generally we use the term divine to refer to something like a god or a supreme being or entity.
Yes, being.
Correct?
What? Yes. So when you're saying being, it means that it never changes.
That's not the only use of the term being.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure people can bastardize words all they want. You know what I mean? They were trying to bastardize woman into saying, well, a man can be a woman, all this kind of shit. Doesn't make it true. You know what I mean? So, like, in terms
yes,
of when
in
we're
the
saying
same way
being
that I
versus
think that
becoming,
people,
yeah.
when
we're saying
in the same
being,
way,
being versus becoming is this whole aspect of, like, everything in the known universe is becoming. Everything is in motion. But there are beings or higher level principles or laws. I guess law is probably the best way to describe it. We're not talking legal laws, fucking like scientific laws, all this kind of shit. Where we even get that notion from goes back to Heraclitus when he points out that everything across the cosmos is in motion, but that means that change is unchanging, which means there must be an unchanging principle that governs the reality that we see, change that we see across the cosmos.
but the problem with this is, again, I can't stress this enough. This is something that exists independent of the scientific method or our ability to test.
Motion is testable.
Yes, motion is testable, but motion isn't directly linked to
Can you
the
point me
expansion
to
of the
anything
universe. It
in the
isn't
known
linked to
universe
the
that doesn't
universal
change?
rules. I'm sure there are many things that exist outside of our ability to be able to perceive them that do not change. Do atoms
Like what?
change?
You just said that you're
Atoms.
sure that there's things outside of our perception that doesn't change. You cannot make that claim. Like, you're the one that's saying you have to have the evidence to prove that everything is in motion. But you just made a claim saying, no, like I'm sure that there's things that we can't perceive that are unchanging. Which again points to a higher power, but you know.
No, it doesn't necessarily point to a higher power. What I'm referring to is there are specific things, such as elements that are made up of atoms that do not change or decay over time. This is an example of one of those things.
Yes, those atoms have electrons. Those electrons spin.
You just asked me if it changed and then you switched to motion. So you understand how
Motion
you're
is
just avoiding
change.
the motion is not change. Well, it depends on how you define change. But when we're talking about bastardizing words, I would generally think it refers to moving from one thing to another.
Changing, yes.
So then you agree that there are things that do not change. So thus that notion would fundamentally
not
be
in the physical
disregarded.
universe.
Okay, so when the scientific method proved that there are atoms that do not decay over time, you're disagreeing with this notion.
Those atoms have electrons that spin. There's still motion.
Okay. I'm going to try to frame this in a way you might be able to understand a little bit better. So
okay, yeah.
when we're talking about changing, we're not necessarily talking about how this thing moves or necessarily its state. We're talking about fundamentally switching
in a different
from
state. That's what
one-
change means. And the only way for him to get from one state to another state is motion.
That's not necessarily true.
What? Let's hear it out. Yeah, that was not necessarily true.
So sure, when we're talking about the state of things, this doesn't necessarily refer to a specific type of thing. It refers to a instance in which that thing or entity, etc., exists within.
So how
without
does
motion.
Yeah. So how does one thing go to a different state without time, without motion, without any change? That's what you
the
just
problem with that is time is relative. So if we're going to use time, we have to create something that exists within relativity. Or unless you disagree with that notion as well.
No, like we're going into like the Einstein and things and all this kind of shit. But even Einstein would agree everything in the universe is changing, is in motion.
Sure.
Like even when you do, even when you're doing but the atoms that like they don't change because they don't decay. It's like, yeah, but those atoms still have electrons and they're spinning, so it's constantly in motion. And if the motion is constant, if the change is constant, if the change is unchanging, then there's an unchanging principle that causes that governs that.
And what would that principle be? This is the problem. You've given. And what would that supreme being be? You keep making an appeal to this idea in which I keep trying to ask you what it is, and you keep changing.
Well, change is constant, but like, what you mean? Like, you keep asking me what it is.
Well, that's not an answer. Yeah. If you ask me a question 3 times and I give you 3 separate answers and I say change is constant, this isn't an answer to my question.
Yeah, it's an undeniable fact. If you're to deny motion is constant,
also not an answer to my question.
If you're to deny motion is constant, like how are we even having this conversation without motion?
I'm sorry, are you even listening to me? I agreed with the idea that motion is constant. I'm asking you to give me an example of this divine rule, and you keep saying, you keep looping into the previous argument.
Is unchanging.
Change is unchanging.
Yes, change never stops.
Correct. So how does that create a divine principle?
Yes, an unchanging principle. A supreme being.
Okay, that supreme being. What is so the supreme being is an unchanging principle.
Yes, that's what being means. It means unchanging.
In this context, yes.
Yeah, so you agree. You're not an atheist. Alhamdulillah, habibi.
Wait, when did I ever say I was an atheist?
Because you're in a debate where I'm saying atheism is dead and you're against.
Yes, does that mean that I have to be an atheist?
Bro, what are we doing here?
Well, what I'm attempting to do is I'm trying to get you to answer a question of how you logically justify the things you were saying, and you keep switching the topic.
But you agree? No, I'm not switching the topic. Like, I'm right on topic. I'm showing you that you're agreeing with everything I'm saying. You're like, I'm not denying that change isn't constant. It's like, yes, okay, so then that's a law, an unchanging law that governs the change.
No, what I'm telling you is that there can be certain truths that exist within a statement that lead to things that are not logically following those truths.
So when we observe like gravity, right? And then we came up with the law of gravity, and you'd say like you cannot justify the law of gravity. That's what you're doing. You're denying like the laws of gravity, the laws of logic, all this kind of shit.
No, I'm not denying the laws of gravity or the laws of logic. What I'm telling you,
they're unchanging principles. That like the law of gravity is an unchanging principle that describes gravity that we see in reality.
Yes, and I'm telling you that there are other phenomenon that exist that could also explain the phenomenon that we know as gravity. It's entirely possible, and science even acknowledges this under the scientific method, that gravity as we see it fundamentally may not be the phenomenon that describes
you're saying
what happens
in the future
we
might get
gravity.
more precise with the law or shit like that. Yeah, but that still doesn't refute the reference, like the thing that we're pointing to.
Okay, because what is the reference in this circumstance?
Just because we have like an ambiguous way of initially describing something doesn't mean that what we're describing is incorrect or it doesn't exist.
Okay, when I ask you this, what is that reference then?
Gravity.
No,
like the physical measurable thing that we call gravity.
Okay, so when I ask you what gravity is, The phenomenon we know is gravity. You said how we measure that reference may change in the future. What is that reference? You can't say gravity is the reference for gravity.
What's that? Law of gravity. So what we call big F equals big G, M1, M2 over R squared.
Okay, so that is the reference.
That's an
correct?
unchanging law, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Well,
that is
to
a divine
this point, yes.
principle.
That is okay. Again, I would hesitate to use the word divine in this specific circumstance. As
you have some like daddy issues with Christianity or some shit like that. I'm not talking about Christianity, bro.
I'm not. I haven't brought up the word Christianity in almost 20 minutes.
It was your whole opening statement. So like this whole thing of like the like I don't want to use divine, or I don't want to use I don't want to use pious or holy or whatever, is a complete misunderstanding of like what these words actually mean.
What do you mean it's a misunderstanding of what these words mean?
Yeah.
You brought religion into this with atheism.
No, you brought religion. Atheism's not a religion. What are
atheism
we
is a rejection of religion.
What are we talking about here?
If you are talking
fucking
about
religion?
No, I never said atheism was a religion. I said atheism is a rejection of
you brought
religion, and we
Christianity
can't
into
talk
this.
about
Your whole opening statement was Christianity, bruh.
What is Christianity, Teriak? Please explain that to me.
I know those that follow Christ.
It is
cool
what?
Dude, I guess.
It is what in practice?
Religion.
Yes. So if you have something that is a rejection of religion, then
you
you have to use religion
you brought
into
religion
the conversation.
You brought religion into this. Atheism is distinctly not believing in a supreme being. Correct?
I agree.
Yeah. That's
and
not
that
like
is
the
in
religion.
reference to what?
I'm quoting ancient Greek philosophers here. This is philosophy, baby.
Which those ancient Greek philosophers were inspired by what? Religion.
No. Socrates.
In many circumstances, yes.
What was Socrates? Why was the reason Socrates was executed?
I have no idea.
Oh my sweet baby Jesus.
If you're going to make the argument that because he rejected some of the principles of religion, you would realize that he's actually a nonconformist and he was actually of a specific denomination of Catholicism that was existing prior to the actual introduction of like the what was it called?
Catholicism existed before Christ.
No, I said, well, in some circumstances, yes, Catholicism did exist before Christ.
What is going on here? Like, I like, did you just hear what you just said?
Yes, because Catholicism became a organized institution after Jesus Christ died. But I believe it was the Second Temple of Judaism and the I want to say the Orthodox Roman Council, which actually introduced the teachings of Catholicism into the church after the death of Christ. This as a fundamental concept, even under a different name, was still being practiced.
Before you said that Catholicism comes before Christ, or in some situations, Catholicism, you can make the case that Catholicism came before Christ. Makes no sense.
Yes. No, as a name, it didn't come before Christ, but as a religious concept,
Plato,
it did.
Aristotle, Heraclitus, like these were all just Christians.
No, I never said they were Christians.
Yeah, so like they didn't bow and worship to Zeus and all this kind of shit.
I mean, well, there were some that did, sure, but like again, these were non-denominational versions of religions of the time. Do you dispute this when there were even religious writings that came from Socrates? He talked about the divine mission.
I'm not disputing that there was a whole Greek pantheon, all this kind of shit. What I'm disputing is when we look at Plato's arguments against atheism, when we look at Heraclitus' argument for the flux, they're not pointing to a religion, bro. This is like strict philosophy.
Okay, so the problem is they're not necessarily pointing to religion, but they're using a religious principle or a foundational principle that was based in religion to justify their things.
Why are you taking the best philosophy has to offer and just giving it to the religious?
Well, I'm not actually.
Yes, you are. You're the one that's claiming that fucking Plato was a Christian or a Catholic or some shit like that.
Okay, so if you want to detach the idea of religion and the influence that it had of the time away from the philosophy, the problem is
Socrates was executed for disbelieving in the gods of the state.
Correct, but he was still religious, was he not?
Oh, my sweet baby Jesus. So he went against the religious order.
Don't bring Jesus into this. This man's suffered enough.
You're the one who brought Christianity into this, bro.
Well, I brought Christianity into this because it's the easiest religion to lump in when we're talking about a rejection of specific religious principles.
No, atheism is strictly the rejection of the rejection of a belief in a supreme being.
Yes, and
yes.
What
so no religion. I never mention religion.
You do realize that the belief of a supreme being is largely tied to religion, correct? You can't be religious
you're the one
and
that's
also
tying it
believe
to
in a
it.
supreme being. Can you give me an example of any principle that believes in a supreme being that is not a religion?
Yeah, Heraclitus when he talks about the logos.
I must say, I'm not actually familiar with that. But I would argue that maybe if this is the case, there would still be a circumstance in which it is the rule rather than the exception when talking about a supreme being or using the term divine, that it's usually associated with religious ideology.
Yeah, like you're the one that's tying like extreme religiosity and all this kind of shit. Your whole opening statement is Christianity. Like, bro, like you need to kind of like get the chip off your shoulder of like Christianity. Because if you want to talk about Christianity, because pretty much you basically conceded the debate at this point. Like, what do you think the point of the Bible is?
It depends. What part of the Bible are you referencing? But I would like to go back to the original idea of how you can't have.
No, you want to talk about Christianity? We can talk about Christianity. You know what I mean? Like in
no,
terms
I don't
of like
want to
when
talk about Christianity. If you want to listen, if you
want to
move on, and we can talk about
statement, it. Why are you running away now, bruh? Let's talk about Christianity.
I'm not running away. I'm trying to keep the topic as it was before because you consistently are changing it. If you want to say I don't want to talk about this anymore and move on to Christianity, we can do so. Is that what you want to do?
You agreed with everything. Like you don't.
No, I didn't agree with everything.
Yeah. Okay. So you agree that like everything in the physical universe is in motion. All right. You agree with that. Yes. Which means that that change is unchanging. You agree with that, which means that there's an unchanging principle, divine law, whatever you want to call it, that governs the physical. And you agreed with that as well.
No, because there's a series of deductions that you are making that don't logically follow through this.
Where's the contradiction?
In this specific, the contradiction, well, it wouldn't necessarily be a contradiction. The problem is it's a fallacy.
What does logic mean?
And
again, if you make a logical fallacy, it's still logical. What are you talking about? You just said it doesn't logically follow, and then you said it's a logical fallacy. Do you know what words mean?
Yeah, I'm very aware of what words mean.
It doesn't follow, but it's still logical.
Okay, so again, when you're talking about logical fallacies, just because it falls within the circumstances of logical fallacies are logical. Yes, but would you adhere to the idea of a logical fallacy as a system for self-government?
That religion is a system of self-governance?
No. When did I bring anything up about... Dude, you need to get past this. I don't know why you keep putting this on me and consistently loping back into religion. I never said anything...
Whose whole opening statement was about Christianity.
It was not about Christianity. I specifically talked about different religiosity. No, I did.
Okay,
I already admitted that I did. Are you not following your own conversation?
Bro, you're the one that done your opening statement. You're the one that brought Christianity into this. I was talking about Plato. I was talking about Heraclitus. I never mentioned anything got to do with religion. I know you're trying to do the religion thing and then trying to do the whole gaslighting thing where it's like, no, you're the one that's bringing Christianity into it because I'm willing to engage if you want to talk about Christianity.
No, but I'm not talking about
with
Christianity.
My arguments,
the problem...
You haven't pointed out where the contradiction is in my argument.
Because you consistently continue to loop this back into something that is away from... Every time I ask you about these principles or these governing systems, you seemingly completely want to go into a different topic.
No, what I'm saying is that there's motion is unchanging, change is unchanging. Ergo, there's an unchanging law that governs the cosmos. And then from that aspect, that proves that there are unchanging laws. For example, what we later discovered to be the law of gravity. It's what made it possible. Because otherwise, it's just pure chaos, pure randomness. You know what I mean?
Well, there is no objective standard. If you want to, sure, let's run with that, right? Let's keep on this topic and not bring religion back into this.
Okay,
are you capable of doing that? Perfect. I've mentioned it once. So just to be clear, when we're talking about chaos theory, specifically in regards to the randomness of universality, how do you make a claim that proves beyond reasonable doubt that there is a divine or governing principle that oversees this when this is scientifically rejected, like at a fundamental level?
Yeah, so all scientists will agree everything in the known universe is in motion. Ergo,
Oh, so you're just not answering. Perfect.
I'm literally directly answering you. You just don't like philosophy.
No, this isn't philosophy. What you're talking about,
It
the
is.
philosophical question. So again, you're attempting to do what is called a generic non sequitur. You are trying to intertwine the philosophical ideas with the scientific method when the scientific method makes no claims as to how philosophical like systems work or how they should work. There is an is-ought statement here, which you are attempting to bridge by conflating one system of science with the second system of philosophy.
When did I say should or ought? You're just pulling random things. You're what is it? You're sinking, bro. You're flailing.
No,
come on. Like, let's stay on topic here.
Flailing.
In terms of the unchanging principle that governs the change.
Answer,
yeah, so how do you explain? How do you explain that change is constant?
Okay, no, I'll answer your question once you answer my original question. How do you explain?
All I've been doing is answering questions.
You have not. So just to be clear, the randomness of universality is something that exists within chaos theory as an understood principle. How do you argue against this when you claim that there is a divine principle or some form of governing principle that exists independent of that?
Identical macroscopic behavior despite having different microscopic details often governed by simple universal laws. Yes. So, like, even the thing you quoted is a universal law.
No, it is not
an unchanging law.
No, Kalam's cosmological argument is what I quoted, and in this specific circumstance, Kalam's cosmological argument makes no. Okay, thank you. It makes no attempt to actually propose how a divine entity, or a god can possibly exist in the state of being with how randomness of universality is applied. It is definitionally the base of chaos theory.
This is like the for God posits that because the universe exists and began to exist, it must have a cause, which is identified as an uncaused necessary being, God. Right? I'm not saying that the universe began to exist or whatever. I'm just saying I'm noting an observation, which is the scientific method. First, you must observe the phenomenon. The phenomenon is motion. The phenomenon is change. Everything changes. If everything changes, that means the change is unchanging. And if change is unchanging, there must be some sort of law that governs that change.
So, okay,
the law of gravity being an example of this.
Then we're going to loop back into my previous example of the observation of the... we're getting there, I promise. So I'm going to loop back into what I had previously stated with the observation that you just claimed of these specific ideas or principles. With the observation of these things, these are generally governing principles that were once disputed to some extent. And then as a result of the technological advancement of science, we have attempted to make some form of cohesive idea or system of governance of these things. So when we attempt to look at these things, we can see... Well, yes, yes, absolutely. We pursue a higher principle, but the problem is the statement that you're
a divine law.
No, like the statement that you are making is one that exists entirely of a relativist structure, as it has fundamentally changed over time, and we can't possibly know that this is the end of the system.
What are you talking about, bro? Like we're not
talking about philosophy anymore.
You do realize you're running away from my argument here?
No, I'm not. I just answered your question. If a divine principle... let me ask you this.
I'll repeat the argument again.
No.
Change is unchanging, correct? The only way to explain the fact that change is unchanging is that there's an unchanging principle causing the change, correct?
Yes. And the way that you are proposing this specific system and how it interacts with the universe is a complete logical leap. It is a leap of faith that I am not going to take because I don't make the claim of objectivity in which you do.
Where's the leap?
The leap is to presume that you have the general understanding, or that anybody has the general understanding of how these systems work in their totality.
Okay, so then we can just throw out science then.
No, I'm not saying that we should throw out science. That's again
your counter to my argument is you're presuming to know, or you're presuming to understand. No, I've made an argument that you can't refute, And now you seems like you're kind of like, oh fuck, like I thought it was just going to be an easy dunk on a Christian. But I'm not Christian.
No, I wasn't here to argue Christianity. That's why I specifically brought up things like Catholicism, Islam, and atheism.
Why was it in your opening statement?
I've answered this 3 times now, but I'll go ahead and answer it again for you. When you're making a claim about atheism and how atheism works, it is a rejection of religious principles. And one of the religions that fundamentally
it's a rejection of a supreme being.
A rejection of a supreme being is often associated with or tied to the idea of religion, is it not?
You're the one that's making that connection, bruh.
This is not me making this connection. This is how words work.
Saying the guy that says I didn't make a logical argument and then claimed there was a logical fallacy, proving that he himself wrong. You don't even know what logic means.
I know exactly what logic means. The problem that I'm having is that when...
You don't.
So, okay, then we can move forward from this. Simple question then. Do you believe that the idea of a divine principle or a divine concept or some form of divine law is detached from the idea of a religious concept or a God? Just answer yes or no and we can move forward from there.
Sure, yeah. Why not?
Okay, sure. So from this point on, we are not going to reference religion. If this divine concept or this divine principle as it exists through fundamentally unchanging law, what is your general criteria for this outside of the current data that we have within science, not philosophy, to determine that this is something that we can't otherwise have independent of testing?
Science came from philosophy. What does PhD stand for?
Well, science may have come from philosophy.
What does PhD stand for?
It's a general, or Jesus Christ. It is a, wait, I don't even remember what the P stands for.
A doctorate of philosophy, you thick cunt.
But anyways, like, we'll move on. So
you're pointing to science when science came from philosophy and say, we're not going to talk about philosophy anymore. Science is...
No, I said that we could talk about philosophy. Well, just chill out. Calm down for a second. I said we can talk about these things.
You're flailing.
No, I'm trying to explain to you where your problem is. My problem is that science, yes, science is a derivative of philosophy, but they attempt to do fundamentally different things. The scientific method is completely independent of philosophy. It attempts to create, using the scientific method, to be able to determine truths. These things are relatively objective. However, the problem is when you have a, well, yeah, you could argue that because there is a consistently changing idea or a consistently changing understanding of those things, which is an argument for relativity.
Yeah, but that we're noting our own intellect at that stage, not the observable universe.
Yes, but our own intellect is the limiting factor of whether or not we can have that observing. Sure. Do you like? But how do you come to the conclusion we are not a god if we're not bringing religion into this? You remember when we said we wouldn't bring religion into this going forward,
again,
and now you're referencing a god structure?
You're the one that's bringing up religion.
I never
mentioned the word religion.
You just brought up God. How can you have a God without a religion,
God is supreme being.
So how do you detach the idea of a God from religion then?
Yeah, so for example, like the Buddhists, they call themselves atheists, right? They say there is no, spaghetti monster, all this kind of shit. But then they'll also say there's Dharma, which is basically Heraclitus's logos, saying that there's a law governing the change across the cosmos.
Sure, and when we attempt
from that one bright idea is where we get science,
and
that's the justification for science.
I don't deny that it came from philosophy. What I'm telling you is that the idea
it's the foundations. Philosophy is the foundations of science. Like, because of that observation, we then know that we should pursue, because these unchanging laws exist, we should discover them.
Yes, and the motivations that came from the philosophical ideas.
We get the scientific method.
And again, if you will let me finish, the original principles that came from those specific ideologies don't make any claim as to how these things work objectively. These were just a general, I would argue they were to some level even a pseudoscience, because a lot of the religious concepts that existed from those original principles, even from things like Buddhism, etc., they were fundamentally disproven as time goes on, because our ability to be able to test these things through the scientific method has actually done retractions as to the original belief systems of these people.
But they'll never deny the logos. They'll never deny that change is unchanging.
That is independent of whether or not the original claim exists. They can use that claim for justification of their
principle.
ideology. Okay,
Yeah.
again, they can use that. They can use a scientific truth as a justification for a claim which can be false. The falsifiability of the claim does not undermine the scientific truth that is based upon.
Yes, but when you say scientific truth, you're presupposing philosophical truth.
No, because science and philosophy attempt to do fundamentally different things.
Okay, what's the difference?
Sure, science attempts to find objective truths, things that cannot be falsified in specific circumstances or ways. However, philosophy, I never claimed that it didn't. But just to be clear,
if an objective truth exists, there must be an unchanged truth is unchanging, correct?
Sure, you can make
it's an unchanging principle. Truth is a divine principle.
And how do you determine whether or not that unchanging truth exists as an unchanging or divine principle or not?
Because if the truth was to change, that specific truth, then truth would be incoherent. You'd be breaking the first law of logic. There's a delineation between like truth and like falsities or falsehoods.
And there are specific things that exist as falsehoods or previous falsifiable truths that we generally accepted as truths, which were not. There are circumstances that I never disagreed with that notion. The problem that I'm having is that there are simply things that presuppose a conclusion that you are adhering to from the truth itself, and then creating a statement that is not true in and of itself as well.
I have no clue what the fuck. I think you're just like trying to pull words. You know what I mean? Like you're saying that like truth is objective. Like you accept truth to be like. If you accept that there's an objective truth, what are you pointing to? Because everything one sec, as a materialist, everything in the material world changes. So you're saying that truth is objective and it doesn't change. So what are you pointing to justify that?
So sure, let me explain what an objective truth is then. When I talk about an objective truth, I mean
what are you pointing
to
make that claim?
Sure, I can give you an example. The laws of mathematics.
No, point to something physical, like I did.
Wait, so you're telling me mathematics aren't an objective truth?
No, I'm saying mathematics is not physical.
So mathematics are a governing system. It doesn't need to be
mathematics
physical.
even exists. You have to first make an observation on the physical.
Yes, and the observation is required by the observer or the agent in this case.
Yes, and that observation is motion. Motion is an unchanging thing.
No, motion is not an observation. Motion is a state.
What are you talking about?
Okay, so
motion. You can't observe motion. So you cannot see my hand moving. You can't see me. Like, is this what we're doing?
No, it's not what we're doing. It's your failure to interpret what I said. I never said motion was not observable. I said motion is not an observation.
So you cannot observe motion. Is that what you're saying?
I can't tell if you're trolling me or not right now.
I genuinely do not understand.
Am I being gaslit right now? I said motion is not an observation. Motion is observable. You can observe motion without motion as an observation.
Yeah. And everything in the universe is in motion.
So does that mean everything in the universe is observable then?
No, is motion.
Okay, so then you agree with me.
Is everything in the known universe, or even you could say the unknown universe as well? Like, is it a principle of the universe, of the cosmos, whatever word you want to use, that everything is changing?
We've already covered this.
Yeah, so I don't see where you disagree. You're saying, well, like, you're being illogical, and then you say I'm using a logical fallacy, which means I am being logical. It's just I'm being fallacious. But then when you point at the fallacious thing, like I said, it doesn't dispute my argument.
Well, because your argument's incoherent is the problem.
Okay, what's incoherent about it?
Well, we just went through the observable motion versus observing motion whole argument of incoherency, and now we're moving on to the next thing.
Observable motion, yeah. One's just like the actual person seeing it versus the actual but you would not deny that motion, like everything is in motion, correct?
We've already covered this.
Yeah, so if everything is in motion, even to evoke the word everything, right? requires some sort of higher being.
Well, again, that higher being has to be demonstrated.
Yes, through motion. We observe
So
motion. Everything in the known universe across the cosmos is change. Change is unchanging, which means there's an unchanging principle that causes change.
No, the problem that I have is...
Problem I have is I don't like Christians, Teriak, and you're not allowed to use words like divine and supreme being and all this kind of shit.
What are you talking about? Are you schizophrenic?
No, I'm just quoting back your own words. Your whole opening statement is about Christianity, bro.
I
you made the
never
claim that Catholics existed before Christ. That Christianity existed before Christ. That was one of your claims.
Yes, and I justified that claim, and you didn't refute it.
Am I being schizophrenic, or am I just repeating your own arguments back to you?
If you are repeating my own arguments back to me, you're failing to understand them, because we already agreed that religion was not to be brought into this 3 separate times, and
Christianity
you continue to bring it in.
Before Christ. It makes no sense.
Well, just to be clear, it was Catholicism, not Christianity. But,
Catholicism specifically, I guess. Okay, yeah, Catholicism existed before Christ. So who the fuck are they talking about?
Why are we continuously looping back into this? I thought you said we weren't going to talk about religion, and you keep looping it back into religion.
You were calling me schizophrenic, and I was like, I can recall the conversation, but you clearly can't. Because you're just throwing out like random shit.
I'm not.
You're saying, "Oh, that's fallacious," but you're not showing me how it's fallacious.
Because I'm trying to explain it, and then you keep saying, "Oh, well, you have daddy issues. You have a hate boner for religion," but we're not talking about any of those things.
Okay, then what's the?
Did you or did you not say those things?
What my argumentation's fallacious then?
Yeah, that is exactly what I'd like to get to. So, can we hone in on exactly why atheism is dead, and the primary argument for atheism being endangered?
Yeah, so like this whole notion of atheism, despite what Daddy Issues over here wants to talk about, where the Catholicism existed before Christ and all this kind of shit, atheism is saying, I don't believe in a supreme being. And from atheism, we get goofy concepts like moral relativism. Holy shit. And basically just degrades society. That's my whole opening statement. You can go back and, like, not even my words, it's Plato's words. Plato would give the death penalty to atheists. Like, if Plato was alive in modern day, he'd be like, wipe him out. These people are retarded. You know what I mean? Because to deny an objective principle, a divine law, you cannot make an argument. Because the only way to make an argument is to point to logic or reason. But you say you don't believe in those divine principles. And then you say, well, no. What about the scientific method, which again is a divine principle?
Well, okay, that is independent of whether or not someone believes in a god or a deity. A god or a deity is an entity a supreme being.
It is a divine law, divine principle, unchanging.
Okay, so then you understand that a god or a supreme being, it can be independent of each other. You've already said that a god and a supreme being can be independent of each other. A god and a deity or a deity, they're not, just to be clear. But in this specific circumstance, even a deity can be independent of a divine idea. And this is why I asked you if we could detach the idea of religion from this specific use of terminology. And now you're
wanted to separate it from religion. Which I did. I pointed to philosophy. That's been my whole case.
And in the philosophical arguments you used, they were in some circumstances based in religion. This is what I described previously as...
What religion?
I already explained this to you.
What religion?
There were many religions. You talked about the pantheon. We talked about non-denominational religions. We talked about other things in which we're making unjustified, illogical appeals to specific gods or deities.
What religion is Heraclitus pointing to when he talks about the logos? One sec. Let me get the full quote.
I'm going to do the quote again. So while you're looking that up, I'll explain it then. So when we're talking about the idea or principle of atheism being a rejection of a god or deity, we've already agreed this can be attached from the idea of a divine principle by his own understanding of the word divine principle, or an irrefutable system that exists independent of a god or deity. So thus your justification for atheism being dead would have nothing to do with rejecting these principles themselves, unless those principles were backed by a god or deity directly.
And universal. It is the rational principle or structure according to which everything happens. All things come to pass in accordance with the logos. Most people fail to grasp because they live private illusions or sensory confusion, even when it's pointed out. Case in point.
Speaking of delusion, can you tell me what the word the logos means?
Yeah, it means word.
word or reason, and it is what?
Yeah, so it's like when the French say je ne sais quoi.
Yes, and specifically the logos when you're talking about
so
Greek.
With the same way the French say, when you say, just for the audience, when you say je ne sais quoi in French, that means I do not know. It's that I do not know. I don't have a word for it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it is a theological concept, by the way.
It's not a theological concept.
Really, go ahead and Google it for me, bud.
So getting back to the logos argument, it's like the rational ordering principle, law-like structure, or intelligible pattern immanent in the cosmos. Do you deny this, or are you saying this is religious?
No, I'm not saying either, which shows that you are not listening to my line of argumentation. My specific claim is that you cannot demonstrate how this works while simultaneously claiming some form of objectivism as... No, that's not how the word empirical works either.
It's physical,
just to be clear.
Measurable.
Well, yes, physical and measurable systems can exist
Motion is physical and measurable, correct?
Yes, but the
Alhamdulillah, Habibi, we got there.
No. You think you got there. Now, let me explain why you didn't.
It's not empirical.
The problem is...
Motion is empirical, yes. Okay, I'm pointing to motion to make my argument. Oh, it's not empirical.
Well, I'm just going to... If you're just going to continue talking over me, I'm going to continue talking over you. I can do this all night. So the problem is that we have a system in which it applies some level of understanding to these things. If you are going to make a claim as to how objectivism applies to the thing you are citing, and then simultaneously, I'll explain it when I'm done. If you're going to make a claim as to how objectivism points to the belief system that you have or the system that you are citing, you have to give an example of how that system fundamentally leads to the conclusions that you are drawing, which you cannot do.
I've done it multiple, but we'll do it again. Okay? Motion is everywhere. Yes?
Okay.
The whole cosmos is becoming. Correct?
Sure.
Yes. Okay. That means that change, in reality, change is unchanging. Change is constant. Correct?
Sure. Let's run
whatever law governs that change. An example of one of that would be the law of gravity.
Tell me what that law is.
Yeah, an example of it would be the law of gravity.
No, I don't want an example of it. I want you to tell me what it is.
I just demonstrated it.
No, you did not.
Yes,
you said. You
so
said motion,
where do we get,
and then you gave me an example of it,
no,
and then you said gravity.
I said
I don't want an example of it. I want the law.
Motion is unchanging, correct?
You can argue that, sure.
Yeah, so there is some sort of law that describes that change.
Yeah, what is that law?
The law of the universe? We haven't cracked that yet. We need to wait on the scientists. What you're asking for is what is the law? What you're asking is the law of the universe.
Yes, and how can you make an appeal to that if you don't know it? Is my problem. This is what I've been trying to get you to answer.
That's where we get the law of gravity from.
Well, the law of gravity, again, I've already explained this. The law of gravity can be a phenomenon that exists independent of our understanding of what the phenomenon we know as gravity is.
Mind independent.
This is the problem that I have. Yeah.
It's objective.
No, it's not objective, just to be clear. You can argue that the mathematics are objective, but the phenomenon we know as gravity can also be explained by multiple other phenomena such as centrifugal force.
But there's still the law of gravity. You know what I mean?
Okay, so do you believe that the law of gravity is unfalsifiable?
So what I'm saying is
what
I'm saying is that, like, in terms of like all this change that we're seeing across the universe, there exist unchanging principles to describe those changing phenomenon. Do you agree or disagree?
Okay. I would agree, but I would say that those principles are something that are inobservable.
What you're doing there is you're pointing to a supreme being.
No, just to be clear, that is not true. You're presupposing that conclusion.
There is something that's non-physical that governs this, or that describes this.
No, I wouldn't argue that it is non-physical. I would say it's non-observable.
So mathematics is physical? The law of gravity is physical?
You could argue that you could argue it's physical because of the implication.
This is why Plato was like, just give him the death bounty. Just give him the death bounty. Like, what are we talking about? Like, yes, the law of gravity is physical. I'm not talking about gravity. Gravity is physical, but the law of gravity is non-physical. Correct?
Okay. Yes and no, because you need the physical element.
No.
Yes, motherfucker. Okay, I can explain this. Again, if you can't keep up, that's not my problem. So when
you're the one who's saying yes and no,
entities,
same, but different.
Yes, because again, I can explain this if you would just allow me to. when we're talking about physical entities, we have things that exist relative to our tangibility or our understanding. If our understanding of these things is incomplete and as a result it is intangible, it is entirely possible it could be a physical or non-physical entity that we are either observing or it's something that exists outside of our ability to understand.
Yeah, are thoughts physical?
You could argue that they are, sure. They come from electrons that are made inside of our head as the neurons fire off, and that is a physical. Yeah. When our neurons fire off, there are electrons in our neurons that create electrical waves that move through our brains that create thoughts. This would be a physical observation.
What causes the electrons?
I'm going to be real with you. I don't know what causes an electron. Can you give me that answer?
You're the one that's making the claim that these thoughts come from electrons. So like, how
sure,
many,
and I'm completely ignorant here. No, I'm giving you the opportunity. I'm ignorant here. How do you make an electron?
I'm the one that's asking you. You're the one that was like teaching me here.
Well, yeah, and I'm telling you, I'm retarded. I deserve the death penalty. Tell me how electrons are made.
You're the one that made the claim.
Tell me how the electrons are made. You just asked me and now you won't answer it. I'm retarded.
You're the one that made the claim.
It to me.
You're the one that made the claim. Don't get emotional.
Teach me, Terry.
You're the one. Yeah, you're emotional. You're the one that made the claim that thoughts are physical.
I'm asking you to teach me. I'm saying that thoughts.
You made the claim.
Yes,
Terry, teach me about my claim.
No, I'm telling you.
What is going on here?
I'm telling you
what the
that
fuck
as
is going
electrons
on?
are fired and neurons are fired, it creates an
you
electrical
said
pulse
that
that moves
come
through
from
the brain,
electrons.
and it creates. Yes, the electrons are required for those neurons.
They're required,
to fire.
But they don't come from.
Well, I mean, generally, you would argue that, sure. But like, again, the problem is you said, where does an electron come from or how does an electron work? Tell me, where does an electron come from in this specific circumstance?
I don't know. You're the one that made the claim that thoughts all of a sudden are physical.
We do not know.
How much does a thought weigh?
Is my claim. I don't know that. This is something that we cannot observe. Yeah. It exists independent of our observation. This has been my claim the whole time.
So now you're saying that non-empirical stuff is empirical. Like, do you not see the retardation that's going on here?
No, because you're attributing the idea of empiricism to something that is not empirical. This is
you're the one that said that thoughts are physical.
What I'm talking about here is specifically the fact that you're trying to adhere to an idea or a principle of what philosophy and science has attempted to do over the last almost 3,000 years in explaining things that cannot be observed or understood by the human mind as of right now due to technological limitations. And you're asking me to answer these questions and then positing that I'm stupid because I can't.
I'm making a logical argument of why there is a
No, you're not making a logical argument. What you're doing is you're adhering to a logical fallacy.
Otherwise you would have. Again, a logical fallacy is logical.
Sure, but why would you want to base your idea on
You're not making a logical argument. You're making a logical fallacy. So I'm making an argument that's logical, that you think is fallacious, but it's still logical.
It is fallacious.
But then again, you're wrong on your claim that I'm not making a logical argument. You just claimed I'm making a non-logical argument or an illogical argument, and then claim that I'm making a logical argument.
So, okay, the problem is when you use a logical fallacy, it is an unsound argument based on a system of flawed logic, or it would just be logical.
Yeah, it's unsound, but it's still logical.
Sure, okay, and I believe that in a logically
so you're the one that's misusing
your
words.
Argumentation doesn't exist. No, I just actually used it in the exact terminology it's described for. The problem is you can use
you made the claim
false
that I made an illogical argument,
to be
and then directly after that you said, oh, you made a logical fallacy, which means you made a logical argument. That's unsound, but it's still logical.
Yes, because there can be logical arguments that are based on misinformation or otherwise untrue.
So I'm still making a logical argument.
You know what? Sure, I'll grant you this. You're making a logical argument that is based on a fallacy
pulling fucking
and misinformation.
Teeth with this going, holy shit. How much do I get extra for being a dentist?
I'm sorry. I'll be as good faith as possible here. You are logical in your misinformation and your inability to make a sound argument. Is this better for you?
Okay, so what is the fallacy that I'm making here?
Yeah, you're begging the question, and specifically referring to the God of Gaps fallacy.
What question am I begging here?
Yeah, the question that you're begging is you're working backwards logically as to how you're making your specific thesis, right? You are presuming that you are correct from the start, and then using that correct.
No, I'm not. I'm not doing tag. This is another thing. How I knew that you prepared. You said, I'm gonna roast this Christian. I'm not a Christian, bruh.
When did I bring up Christianity?
I'm not your daddy. Okay, I'm making a philosophical argument here.
When did I bring up Christianity? What are you talking about?
I'm not doing tag here. I'm pointing to
so
an empirical fact of the known universe. And from that, I'm deducing and proving that immaterial laws, divine laws, exist. Mathematics exist, even though it's not physical.
So again, I already said that there can be physical and non-physical entities or things that exist independent of.
How do you prove that?
And this is why.
How do you prove that?
Well, that's the problem.
How do you prove that non-physical laws exist? Go ahead.
Yeah, sure. And I can explain this. The way you do that is you would make an appeal to, like, I guess what you would call a lack of information. We don't have the technological ability or the understanding to be able to prove these things beyond reasonable doubt. When you apply reasonable doubt specifically to these things, you have a circumstance in which you must accept either the most reasonable cause or the most likely cause to determine whether or not something exists within probability. Then you can use a series of deductions or inductions based on that information to determine whether or not it follows the scientific method.
Yeah, but again, like, even for us to value the scientific method, you are presupposing that the scientific method exists. I'm telling you, prove that the immaterial exists.
That's the problem. You can't prove a negative. This is a logical fallacy.
How is that a negative? Prove that the immaterial exists.
Yes, because if immaterial, what does immaterial mean to you?
Non-physical.
No, immaterial doesn't mean non-physical. It means independent of circumstance. And if something is independent of circumstance, how do you prove that it exists? You can't prove a negative.
Yeah, so I'm talking about physical and non-physical. Mathematics is non-physical, correct?
You could argue that. We already went over
so
this
when you're talking about the non-physical, how do you prove the non-physical exists?
Well, that's the problem. You can't prove a non-physical entity exists without a physical observer.
So
we already went over this.
You're just doing dogma then. Your dogma is just a scientific method.
It's not dogmatic in any way. No,
it is. Okay, what's the difference between dogma and an axiom?
An axiom generally is a idea or a principle that can be broken down into a system of, I guess, what you would call truths, versus being dogmatic is something that is, I guess, what you would call an undeniable
truth. Yeah, so the boat taken is true.
Both the same thing. True, yes.
Yeah. So they're the same thing,
but they're fundamentally different because an axiom can be created.
Scientists talks about axioms. The religious talk about dogmas, and then you criticize the religious, saying you and your dogmas, but it's the same thing. You have axioms. You can't actually prove. Yeah, you're just blindly following science. You actually can't prove the science is valuable.
Is your argumentation here that science is not valuable? Wait, no, hold on. I want to hear you. Well, no. Is your argumentation here that science is not valuable?
No, I can prove that science is valuable.
Yeah, I can too. Then why did you make the claim that I'm assuming that science is not valuable?
You just said, no, I can't. You said that's where the problem is, and we actually can't do like. Are you? What is going on?
Well, no. Okay. Do you think that there's a difference between? Okay, let me ask you this, right? If we have a theory, something that we can't prove definitively or concretely, but is the most likely or the most probable outcome or answer to a question that we have, but despite the lack of ability through technology or our observations cannot concretely prove, do you think we should completely disregard this theory?
No, I guess.
Okay, so then you can accept the idea that we can have systems in which we accept the most probable cause for something without definitively knowing that is it. This is how many scientific circumstances work.
I know how to reach these kids, okay? Remember when Dr. House says, like, everybody lies? Yeah?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so, like, how does one ascertain truth when everybody lies?
Well, you use the scientific method.
You use the laws of logic.
But you've already ascribed to the fact that logic can be flawed and it exists within things like fallacies and misinformation.
No.
Yes, because we went over this earlier. I specifically told you that you use a logical fallacy based on misinformation and a lack of understanding of things to justify those principles.
When you say like the scientific method, what you're presupposing is the laws of logic. This is why, like, Dr. House is like Sherlock
Yes.
Holmes, like 100% logistician. Like, everything has a reason, everything has a cause.
Well, it depends on what
All this
kind of
kind of shit.
logic you follow,
Yeah.
because there are things like circular logic. There are things like there are multiple
the
different types of
fundamental
logic.
laws of logic.
Can you explain to me the fundamental laws of logic then, and how they apply to different ideologies?
First law is the law of identity. Second law is law of non-contradiction. And third law is law of excluded middle.
Yes,
Meaning,
in the law,
we can identify things. So A, for example, and then A equals A, right? A doesn't equal B. So we have A, B, let's just use the alphabet, right? A, B, C, D, E, F, G, all that kind of shit, right? We identify all these things. And then A, and then this is where we get to the second law, which is the law of non-contradiction. A does not equal not A.
Yeah, I'm aware. And
Yeah.
the problem that
So
I have
without-
is the law
without-
of the excluded
with-
middle,
without-
which specifically
with-
is a proposition
yeah,
that states that something
yeah,
that is either true
without-
or the negation
without
of
those
truth
fundamental
with no other
laws,
option. And this is the
without-
problem that
yeah,
you reject this.
Without those fundamental laws, like, none of this is possible. We aren't even able to have a coherent argument.
Well, I feel like I'm not having a coherent argument now, but that's a different problem in and of
No,
itself.
no.
The third
Don't
law
run,
of logic,
don't
in which we
run,
talk about the
don't run,
excluded middle, is
don't
either
run.
that there is a truth
Do
or a
not run.
non-truth system
Do not
with no
run from
other
this, sir.
option.
Yes,
I'm
so
not
we're
running
on the
from
law of
it.
identity. Yeah, we're on the law of identity, right? So
And I don't
if-
disagree with. Okay, listen
Yeah,
to me. If
so
I
if A
agree on the
equals
first
A,
two
can
propositions
A equal
and not the
A?
third proposition, then why ought we not talk about the third proposition?
Yeah, so I'm not making a short argument. So if A equals A, can A equal not A?
No.
Alhamdulillah, that's a foundational truth.
Yes, I never disagreed with this logic. You just like hearing yourself
Yes,
talk. So let's
but
get on
to
to the third one then.
To prove that that's an unchanging principle, what do we have to appeal to?
You have to appeal to logic. That's what this is. This is what we're talking about. The laws of logic.
No, my empirical argument.
Yeah, in your empirical argument and empiricism and how you
The
use
logic
the word is fundamentally
Proves
flawed.
the empirical proves the logic. Goes both ways. It's bisexual,
Yes.
my friend.
I know a lot about that, believe it or not. So we're talking about the excluded middle specifically, and the thing that you want to avoid, in which there is an assertion or a proposition that either a truth statement exists or there is a negation of that truth with no other option. What I'm telling you is that you are ignoring this conveniently. Notice how you went completely past the third law of logic and only talked about the first two that we agreed on, because you know that this exists independent of your structure.
Okay, how does it exist independent of my structure? What are we even talking
I
about?
already demonstrated this to you, and I talked about how there can be physical and non-physical entities that exist independent of the laws of logic.
how'd you
And
prove
if
the non-physical?
require,
You have to use the
well,
empirical.
that's the problem.
What else? One sec. What else
you
you have to
require-
prove the non-physical?
I
Other
can
than
explain
physical.
this. I've already done this. You require a physical being or an actor in this specific circumstance to be able to observe this specific phenomenon, and that's how you prove it. The problem is when
Yes,
you're working
you
with
use the
imperfect
physical to prove the
information-
non-physical.
Yeah, and when you're working with
Wait,
imperfect information,
yes, you
do not-
said yes to that. You use the physical to prove the non-physical.
How do you do that outside of that, Terry? Explain it to me.
That's what I'm pointing to with motion. I'm using a physical phenomenon to prove the non-physical law behind it.
All right, perfect. So I'm glad you agree with me completely. We're going to move on past that then. So what
You're
we're
the one that
talking about
denies
is
the
using
supreme
an-
being.
No, that's not at all
Yeah.
the case. So what I'm talking
So-
about is we're
So you
using
don't
a
deny supreme
specific
being?
I never.
I th-
well,
I
okay,
think I just
depends on what you're
converted someone,
referring to.
boys.
Supreme. No, it depends on what you're referring to as a supreme being, because we're talking about two things independent of each other. Your idea of a supreme being is based in the idea that it presupposes you are correct in your assessments of how those things work.
No,
You
I'm
conflate
not being
science
tagged.
and philosophy.
I'm not
and then you
presupposing
are-
anything.
Can we just talk about the excluded middle, please? Like, you keep on trying to deviate away
You're the
from
one
this
that's saying
'cause you
that
don't
you're
wanna talk about it.
presupposing and like you're basically
you
trying to
are.
use like, because I've heard the arguments before. Like, you're trying to use like tag counters and all this kind of shit.
No.
I'm not making a tag argument. I'm pointing to motion, an empirical phenomenon. I'm
Okay,
using the
and what I'm
empirical, which you
telling
just
you-
agreed with. This was
And
actual like sound argumentation that you agreed with, that we use the empirical to prove the non-physical or the logical or the logos as
And we
Hercules
can-
would put it, right?
And
It's
we
how
can go
beautiful
back
your
to what
logic,
my
logos.
original.
I think we should go back to logos. But in
We can
terms of
use
like
my
this, you
original
agree
argument.
with this as a believer in the scientific method and all this kind of shit, right? So you've just agreed to my argument.
No. So again, when we're talking, let me explain it in a way that you can understand. I might have agreed with the principle that your argument is founded upon, but the truths that your argument are founded upon lead to inconsistencies and logical fallacies that I don't agree with. And that's because when we're talking about, I keep trying to explain it, but you keep wanting to run off on something else. So when I explain it this time, I would hope you would answer instead of running away for a 16th time. Yeah. When we're talking about the law of the excluded middle, it is either a truth or a negation of truth with no other option. When we talk about how we have a system in which we have a limitation of technology and require a physical actor to observe a non-physical entity or a system or a governing principle, how do you determine whether or not we have the complete information of that claim before determining that it is objective? The simple answer is
okay. I can give the easy counters. The easy counters, like imagine we're on the beach right now. Kai's got his little cocktail, maybe mojito or something like that. We got the sun hat on. Beautiful, right? We're on the beach, right? Is there a finite amount of grains of sand on that beach?
I would have to say yes. There cannot be an infinite amount.
But you haven't tested it. You haven't literally picked up every single individual and counted it. You don't know the total number of grains of sand on that beach, but you were somehow able to determine that there is a finite amount of grains of sand on that beach.
But this is the problem. You're adhering to the God of Gaps fallacy, and
I'm not doing God of Gaps.
You are.
You done the grains of sand of the gaps, apparently.
The grains of sand of the gaps. All right. So we're going to go ahead and run with that then. So when we talk about the God of the Gaps fallacy, it specifically implies that there are certain circumstances where you overlook the lack of ability to test a system or a principle or even a structure, and you just assume it to be true because it is either the most likely or the most conclusive thing. No, I did not do that.
Yes, you did. There's a finite amount of grains of sand on the beach.
Okay, so then let's
Is it possible to count every single grain of sand on that beach?
Absolutely.
Yeah. It's impossible to physically go through each grain and count each grain, correct?
No, it would be possible. The problem is, again,
did you one sec? Did you do the test to verify that when you claimed that it was finite? No. What was your reasoning? What was your reasoning for saying that it was finite?
The reasoning for saying that it is finite is because you adhere to a system or a structure in which you appeal to the most likely or the most probable outcome. Thus, if that amount of sand was infinite, it would be untestable, but we know this to not be true.
Yeah, so again, like I said...
So answer my question then. Instead of asking me a question, answer my original question.
We're not running away from this. We're not running away from this because you ran away
from
the exact same logic that I just applied.
No, my friend. Answer my question.
There's no kind of like, okay, we need to empirically prove and count and have a definitive number of the amount of grains of sand on that beach. Well, we can make the claim that there is a finite amount of grains of sand on that beach because of the impossibility to the contrary.
I never said the impossibility. I never said the impossibility of the contrary. I said what is probable. I never said what is possible. When you talk about impossible, that means that it cannot be. There are circumstances in which probability can determine whether or not something can be possible, regardless of its probability.
Yeah, it would be impossible for the beach to have an infinite amount of grains of sand, correct?
Well, that's the problem, is that until we test
it, we cannot know. That's just the fact, yes or no?
Well, no, that's a problem. That is definitely what a problem is.
That is something that requires you literally done it right in front of everybody. 4K HD, take the pictures, boys. You literally said there was a finite amount of grains of sand on the beach, and I demonstrated the logic behind that is the impossibility to the contrary, to which you were even saying like the possibility, and then you caught yourself and you didn't use that word because you knew that you just basically you're backing up exactly what I'm saying. That is the impossibility to the contrary.
No, I specifically
used the 5-minute warning
and probable. So when we talk about probabilities, it is independent of impossible. Because if something is impossible, that means there is an absolute zero chance of something to be. Yeah. You can create a system in which you can adhere or appeal to the most probable or most likely answer to a system, and you can determine it to be likely as fact versus independently or trying to objectively stating as an absolute or an impossibility that something doesn't exist.
Okay, so I'll demonstrate it again, right? If motion is constant, right, that's an observable fact, right? Can motion be non-constant?
It depends on what
It
you
would be
define as
impossible.
motion.
It would literally be impossible because reality wouldn't exist. Without motion, reality wouldn't exist. We wouldn't even be able to have this conversation. In
Well,
order
again,
for
this
there
is
to
the
be even be
problem.
humans,
Before
there
we-
has to be motion. Your heart has to be pumping. You have to be
When
breathing.
we talked about this
There's all these.
before, we
One sec,
determined
there's
that
all
there are
these different
certain-
forms
okay.
of motion, right? So it's literally impossible to the contrary. Motion
So
is constant.
again,
Ergo, it's
then-
governed by a constant principle.
It is impossible to the contrary. So when we talk about how the scientific method has proven that there are certain atoms that exist independent of changing state, independent of the motion itself, you would say that you disagree with the laws of science.
Do those atoms have electrons? Do those electrons spin, aka motion?
In this circumstance,
Boyakasha.
no, because they don't decay.
The atoms don't decay, but the electrons still spin.
And if the electrons spin, that is a form of motion that exists independent in some circumstances of an atom that it is in contact.
So the electron is independent from the atom?
It can be.
Okay, it
I
can
believe- in
be,
fact, I believe it can
maybe, depends. I don't know. Like, bro, come on. Like, we're talking philosophical here. You don't need to do the whole, like, I'm not going to give out to the Christians. I'm not Christian, bro.
I'm not talking about Christianity. What
Yeah.
is your obsession with Christianity?
You have a hatred towards Christianity that you revealed in your
No,
opening
I
statement.
don't.
You do. Like you're
Okay,
saying
you know
like the problem, Teriak, is when you use words like divine, when you use words like pious, a supreme being, that makes me uncomfortable because then some of the things the Christians have been saying to me it actually checks. You know what I mean? And like this whole kind of like notion that you're saying that it's like there's no way to empirically test everything in the universe, which means you cannot make the claim that everything in the universe is in motion. The impossibility of the contrary proves that.
Well, okay. So again, we're gonna go ahead and move right past that because I have no idea what that has in reference to anything. But
It's
when we're
been my
talking about
whole
whether
argument.
no, it doesn't
Motion,
matter. Your core
change
argument is independent of the
is
thing that you just said
unchanging.
last. So what I'm going to say is that you can have an atom that exists independently of an electron that was potentially or originally tied to it, because when we talk about how specifically atoms move and the ions that are associated with those atoms, you can have atoms, and we have seen atoms within our observable universe that do not decay, which means that they are independent of motion, which disproves your
can
theory.
an atom exist without electrons?
It is if I, it
Can
might be
be.
possible. Yeah, it can. It's possible. It might not be probable, but it is possible.
Oh my god. Okay, what element would that be? An atom with 0 electrons.
So it would just be a bare nucleus.
And
I
that-
see you're laughing because you
and-
can't keep up
and
with the
that wouldn't be in
conversation. If it
motion
gets too
whatsoever.
scientific for you, if it gets too
and that-
scientific
and
for
that
you, I'm
would
sorry.
not- and that would not be in motion. That would be
Yeah, you can have. Well, there are certain
that atom
nucleuses
wouldn't.
that exist.
Yeah.
Well, if you
that
allow me to
atom wouldn't be on the
explain,
planet.
yes, there are certain. Okay, I'm just going to have to
Planet
talk
spins.
over you then. So, anyways, what we're talking about here is we're talking about a bare nucleus or an atom that exists independent of motion because it does not properly decay or deteriorate. We have in science observable instances of this which go against your idea or your theory of how motion exists, and just again uses your illogical idea of how these systems
It's-
work to
it's
presume you are
logical.
correct.
But you
Sorry,
keep
it's a
saying it-
logical
you-
fallacy. Sorry.
You
My
keep saying
apology.
illogical.
Your
Yeah, you keep
logical
saying
fallacy.
illogical, but it's actually logical. And then like even the critique that you said, where it's the god of the gaps, like that's not the argument I'm making, bruh.
It
You need
is
to find.
actually.
You need to.
Just because you're not aware of it doesn't mean that it's not the
Yeah,
argument that you're
because
making.
it's the impossibility to the contrary. I'm not making any logical leaps.
Well, that's just an infinite regression.
What are you doing? Munchausen trilemma now? It is a brute fact.
All right, so we are at about time. Did we want to get another 15 minutes, or are we satisfied with where that landed?
I'm Gucci
I mean,
away,
I'm
baby.
satisfied.
Mida?
Yeah, I'm satisfied with that.
Okay, so Mida satisfied. You're good, Teriak? So
Yep.
we go to closings. All right, so go ahead and start us off, Teriak.
Yeah. So what we heard was like a bunch of agreements, and then you're just using fallacious thinking, but to not actually explain the leap that I've made is like that's the fallacy. If we want to start calling out fallacies, that's the fallacy. Where you just say that's a fallacy, I don't have to deal with it. That's the fallacy. The more you know. So again, like my argumentation is quite sound. It's change is constant. To even deny that is retarded. You know what I mean? Because to even deny that presupposes motion, presupposes change. You know what I mean? So once we have that, the only way to describe that is to have an unchanging principle, an unchanging law, a divine law, a supreme being to describe that phenomenon. It's very simple. It's philosophy. It's like you guys, like I said, like you guys are literally handing all the W's over to the Christians, to Andrew Wilson, to Jay Dyer and all this kind of shit because at this point you are denying science. It's retarded. But appreciate you having me on, Kai, and Maita, appreciate you being the opponent. Like I said, atheism dead, boys. Rejoice, rejoice. Atheism is dead. With that, I see the rest of my time.
All right, Maita, your closing statement.
Yeah. So as you've seen from my opponent who attempted to shift away from the arguments I was making and revert back into a religious concept that even he doesn't adhere to or believe in to any extent, and avoid all of the questioning that I was giving, as well as adhering to logical fallacies and misinformation is something that is very common. And the reason that atheism is actually the problem is they use the sort of, I guess, what you would call illogical systems and conflate the ideas of science and philosophy within their own confirmation bias to hand wave away any problems that exist within their ideology. And rather than trying to move forward and creating a new understanding of how these systems work, rely on the more primitive understandings of how they work to try to justify the things that they believe because they're scared of having their worldview shattered. And as a result of that, I believe that humanity is likely going to have a regression as to how far forward we're going with scientific and philosophical thought as we continue to adhere to the systems and principles that exist rather than trying to challenge them in the notions that they provide and just assuming the correctness of them as objective truth without providing some level of objectivity. It always relies on a relative system that is always created that cannot prove itself beyond reasonable doubt and relies on the principles that it adhered to begin with to be able to consider itself just or objective without actually giving any reasoning to such. And I concede the rest of my time.
All right. So with that, checking if the chat has any questions. I'm not going to ask that question. So on my end, to Teriak, in the demonstration of the idea that things are unchanging, what does it signify that causes these things to be unchanging?
Yeah, that change itself is unchanging, and you need to be able to explain that. And this is where we get like the justification for the law of gravity, for example. This is an unchanging principle that describes a changing phenomenon in the known universe. You know what I mean? Like I pick up this thing, drop it. What describes that? The law of gravity. That explains that. You know what I mean? In terms of the like justification, it's like the mere fact that everything physical changes. We're all becoming. That's why they refer to it as a supreme being. You know what I mean, another way to think about it is like the whole simulation theory. Very popular apparently in modern day, like where basically even a simulation, think of it like computer simulation, that has to have a power source. The impossibility to the contrary. So, you know, to me, I think that's pretty straightforward. But sometimes the simple things aren't. You know.
Ida, any response to that?
Yeah, I would just say that the idea of change is unchanging, and specifically how that works is, well, I didn't feel like I needed to point this out because the problem is the ideology that I adhere to is also paradoxical. But I would say that there are simple or fundamental rules that exist independent of those. And as those paradoxes arrive, we will always lack the ability to test the upper limits of how those things fundamentally work. But I would say that we shouldn't settle for paradoxical ideology and logical fallacy.
All right. So to you, Maida, does the existence of unchanging principles point to anything specific that causes these unchanged principles?
Depends on the principle itself, because you could have a principle that exists within the, like, let's say you have a scientific field and a principle is consistently unchanging over time. This could point to a pattern in which you would use the scientific method to determine whether or not something is I guess what you would call a truth or an objectivity. However, if you had something like a moral principle that was unchanging over time, you could have a system in which challenges that under a different moral framework, and you could determine whether or not that thing is consistent or not within all of the sort of philosophical justifications in the multiple different fields that they have. A great example of this would be something like you have certain like epistemological, ontological, and deontological fields of philosophy. I'm going to make an adherence to the ontological and deontological side with someone like Immanuel Kant with the categorical imperative. He used this notion to challenge the idea that morals came from God rather than a system in which could be used to decide how society ought to treat each other to create a system that is more pragmatic.
Right.
Yeah, so in terms of like the moral argument, like it's very easy to dismiss the whole moral relativist. It's like, just get all these abortion advocates to refer to it as killing children. But of course they won't, because they know that doesn't work, because humans, the morality is an actual like objective phenomenon. Hence we have demoralization. And why demoralization is bad. You lose the will to live. And in terms of like the unchanging principle, like that's the foundations of science. That like that mere observation that everything in the physical is in motion. The only way to explain that is an unchanging principle. And the same way we're standing on the beach and says there must be a finite amount of grain of sand on this beach because the impossibility of the contrary is the same principle that we're applying in terms of the motion argument.
Right. So we don't seem to have any questions coming from the chat.
Like I hate these. Again, shout out to Kai. Again, put on a great show. But I fucking hate these. The Discord thing, because then I can't check my messages and all this kind of shit. You know what I'm saying? So, uno momento, por favor. Let me get all this shit set up with the Twitch and the Kick as well, just in case. Just in case, ladies and gentlemen. Let me pin this. And then pin this. Bada bing, bada boom. So if you want to join in the cope. One second, let me set the thing up. Okay, right, perfect. So we're going to wait for the raid and then... Oh wait, should we wait for the raid? Oh no, because the Twitch... Oh, okay, one sec. Let me put this shit together. So I need to go into separate StreamYard account. StreamYard, and then I need to change the thingamabobs. So open panel post debate stream. Okay. Sure, why not? We'll do this. Bada bing, bada boom. Okay, and then I have to go over to YouTube. You lost terrible start coping. Unbelievable, Shante. I haven't even started the cope stream. I haven't even fucking started the cope stream. Por favore. So, wait, how do I raid in Twitch? Oh, fuck. Okay, one second. Let me just... Telling you, this is going to end up fucking up. I'm telling you. Please be patient. My mom just take on. Okay, so unbound post space stream. Boom. Beautiful. So then I need to go into this one. Sorry guys, a lot of streamer stuff going on right now. So let me do, first of all, let me do this. And then we go to this. Then we do this. So streaming live from Cope in Hagen. My man. Did you say I saw green grass in the vision I did see from Jesus, and the green grass means everybody saw the vision? Did you say that? No? Wait, what? I'm not Christian, bro. I'm not Christian. How many times must I say, per favore, chatta?
Per favore! Per favore! Perché rischiamo veramente di diventare il campo profughi d'Europa. Rischiamo veramente di essere lo zimbello del mondo. Ci stanno ridendo in faccia in tutto il mondo. Vi prego.
Vi prego, chat. Vi prego. Okay, so I think I have this set up. I'm pretty sure I'm going to end up fucking this up. But boys, just if you can, go to the channel, give it now a sub. And like I said, yeah, we're gonna try do it now, William. Boys, I'll see you in a little bit. Oh, 1 sec, I need to do. Oh my god, I need to set up this shit on this side. Oh my god, unbelievable! This streaming thing. Nobody told me this streaming thing was going to be difficult. Like I'm literally like Pepe. You know what I'm saying? My mom took Tylenol. You know You know what I'm saying? So, right, one sec. This should work. Bada bing. So if I click this and then do this, so then technically I should be live on this end. And play a little bit of Soviet connection. I'll see you in a little bit, folks.
Why wouldn't you dedicate yourself to public service?
Because I think it's a very mean life. I would love and I would dedicate my life to this country, but I see it as being a mean life, and I also see it as somebody with strong views and somebody with the kind of views that are maybe a little bit unpopular, which may be right, but may be unpopular.
I am your voice. So to every parent who dreams for their child, and every child who dreams for their future, I say these words to you tonight. I am with you, I will fight for you, and I will win for you. We will make America strong again. We will make America safe again.